Welcome to a platform where we debate on the top stories of the NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, and other leagues with the best in the world of sports. You'll also get interviews with many athletes and media talents at several basketball events, including the WNBA and college basketball. My name is Rafiq Ulwazon, and this is Nothing But That Sports Talk.
Awesome.
Welcome to another episode of Nothing But That Sports Talk. I'm Rafiq Ulwazon alongside Katie Louver, and you probably seen the work for a publication called Awful Announcing, and I've read a couple of tweets from that publication, and there's a lot of awful announcing, but hopefully we'll get into some not so awful announcing as we talk about everything going on in the sports world. Welcome to the show, by the way.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. Now, why don't we get a little bit about how your career kind of kicked off?
Yeah, so I received my PhD from the University of Texas last May. I studied NCAA policy thank you, and the intersections of sport and society. So I was really looking at a lot of off the field issues in sports. And around the time that I was digging into that research, name, image, and likeness was taking off. Like it was being debated in state legislatures. That was around 2019, 2020. And so I was doing all this research, and the problem was that the academic publishing press could not keep up with the news cycle. And so I started blogging, and I was just blogging about, the things that I was researching, things in the news. And nobody read my blog, but thankfully I got picked up by a small sports outlet. And I started freelancing there, writing about name, image, and likeness developments and COVID waivers and like ethical issues in sports. And then thanks to social media, that work really snowballed. And so now I'm a pretty regular contributor, like you said, for a site called Awful Announcing, where I mostly cover women's sports and sort of the off the field, off the court topics in women's sports, and also getting into a little bit of analysis about women's college basketball players as well.
Yeah, that's very nice. And getting to talking about awful announcing, I kind of get an idea about this because the whole point of awful announcing is to pinpoint any not so great announcing that broadcasters do. Like, and see, like, why don't you give some examples about any not so great broadcasting that you witnessed while working for awful announcing?
Oh, so I covered the Sabrina Ionescu and Steph Curry 3-point competition, and the Kenny Smith comments about how, like, oh, Sabrina should have shot from the women's line. And I talked about some of like the benevolent sexism that was wrapped up in those sentiments. More recently, I also covered the whole Gregg Doyel exchange with Caitlin Clark. So, I have covered some awful announcing for awful announcing. Thankfully, though, most of what I do, it's not like super critical, because like when I was a PhD student, I was a very critical researcher in my field. So I have been able to cover like a lot of really good news and just like big developments in women's sports, which have been fun. But like I will also call out the awful announcing when it's warranted too.
Yeah. Now we get to the part where you talk about the Sabrina Ionescu and Stephen Curry awful announcing from Kenny Smith. My regular contributor Carmen Holland, shout out to her. She kind of outed Kenny Smith for saying all the stuff that he said, and yeah, that's kind of disrespect because come on now, women can play basketball no matter what hoop they're shooting the ball at, and you cover sports. I mean, I know you say you don't cover NBA, but you cover basketball long enough. You got a PhD. You got a PhD sitting in the room somewhere. You cover sports long enough to know that women are just as good as men at playing basketball.
Yeah, and for me, that was the really disrespectful part of that whole commentary is, Sabrina Ionescu, she outshot the majority of NBA players at 3-point competition. The only one she didn't outshoot was Steph Curry, who is arguably the best 3-point shooter in NBA history. And for the immediate commentary to criticize her for what she just did when she excelled from the men's line, it really didn't make a lot of sense. And I wrote in my article about what I think Kenny Smith was getting at is this idea, that Sabrina was there to support the women's game. And so because of that, Kenny Smith believed that she should get an advantage for the betterment of women's sports. But again, for me, the fact that she was out there competing and the fact that Steph Curry didn't go easy on her and didn't let her win, like that's the ultimate respect as an athlete. And I wrote about, the response from Under Armour, and just like the exchange of branding between Nike and Under Armour throughout that whole competition, because before the competition, Nike posted, their very iconic copywritten ad style, and it just said best don't miss, aimed at Steph Curry. And then Under Armour shot back after the competition with a similar ad that said he don't. And so for me, I was like, that is way more respectful, to acknowledge the fact that Steph Curry beat a formidable, respectable, elite athlete, rather than saying like, oh, he should have gone easy on her and handed her the win. So yeah, for that whole, I remember watching that competition and just like immediately messaging my editor and being like, Matt, I have to write about this. I'll have it to you on Monday. Because it was just bizarre to me.
Yeah, I mean, you have to. I mean, that's one of the angles that you have to cover because you focusing on topics not just about the competition's own, but the way that the whole media and the brands manage to invest themselves into that competition.
Yeah, and thankfully, we're in an era of women's sports where I think women's sports generally, especially women's basketball, are about to absolutely take off. Like we've seen, all of the statistics are there, and they've been there for years, that women's sports can be just as popular as men's sports. What's been really absent all of these years has been investment and buy-in, and marketing. And so, in 2021, when Sedona Prince created that viral TikTok pointing out the discrepancies in treatment between the men's and the women's March Madness tournament, the year after that was the first season that women's college basketball was even allowed to use the trademark March Madness. And so you see just like these steep increases in popularity and viewership, in sponsorship dollars, everything from that year on. And a lot of that was propelled also by people like Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark. But those level of talents have been in women's sports for a very long time, and I think we're just now starting to appreciate it as an industry. There are issues with that, of course, like the whole Gregg Doyel debacle kind of highlights all of this. And the issue is that because women's sports are becoming mainstream so quickly, I don't think that sports media generally is quite prepared to adequately cover women's sports in a way that's, respectful, in a way that's engaging, in a way that isn't sexist. And so I think that is going to be a learning curve that's going to be an issue for at least the next several years. But all of the momentum right now is really, really positive.
Yeah, and picking back off the Gregg Doyel situation, I mean, I'm sure he probably didn't really need to say it, but the fact that it kind of came out the way it did, he kind of did it to himself. And a lot of people on the internet, even people that I personally interviewed in the past and that actually built a friendship with, we was all saying the same thing. I mean, Gregg Doyel, what were you thinking saying that? That's all. That's what everybody's saying in the back of their mind. I mean, this is Caitlin Clark, a number one pick in the WNBA draft that took place in Bam Theater, one of the most watched WNBA drafts you've seen in a while. Just as much, just as much viewership as the NBA drafts get every year. And you go say you will ask that question like that. I mean, I don't know what you're thinking, fam. I don't know what you're thinking.
Yeah, and I saw, thankfully with this issue and just like that exchange, I didn't see a lot of people downplaying it, which I was kind of surprised about, because when we see that kind of stuff, normally like the immediate reaction from the internet is to be like, oh, it wasn't that bad, or like that wasn't sexual harassment. And like I saw some of that, but like the vast majority of the consensus was like, yeah, that was out of line, that was uncalled for. And there was some talk about intent, but in those kinds of situations, it's always impact over intent. Accidental sexism, accidental sexual harassment is still sexism and sexual harassment. So the intent of all of that doesn't matter nearly as much as how it impacts the people involved. And I think it really, I don't want to say it's like a good learning experience, because I hate to, be like, oh, Caitlin Clark taught him this thing, when it's like he should have known that. Like it's his job. And I just think that, exchanges like that are going to happen a bit more as this male dominated industry adjusts to having more women becoming mainstream. I don't think that, it necessarily is a positive thing that these kinds of things keep happening. Cause like, we even saw back in the 2023 Women's World Cup with Jenny Hermoso and Spain after, like right after they won the Women's World Cup, Louis Rubiales sexually assaults her in front of a global audience, and
Oh
so
yeah, you talking about
yeah,
that part where he kissed that athlete in the mouth, something like that? I do remember
yeah,
seeing that. That was uncalled for, man.
yeah, absolutely uncalled for. And it's one of those things too where, it's easy to say like, oh, well, the Greg Doyle thing isn't like that level. And it's like, yeah, it's not that level, but it's on that same playing field. And so I was really happy, honestly, with how a lot of sports media reacted to that. Like there wasn't a lot of downplaying of the severity. The Indy Star has suspended him. And so there were consequences for those actions, which is good. Um, I think we definitely still have a long way to go in sports media, but I think that female athletes are becoming more and more comfortable calling out that kind of behavior, as is sports media. And I think these athletes are doing a really great job of just holding their own in the spotlight and controlling the narratives that surround them.
Exactly. And to conclude this conversation, we just got, I mean, well, as people like me and you that interview these athletes or been around athletes, we just have to be careful about how we speak to these athletes when we're asking the questions that they need to hear when we're talking to them. And I've had my personal experience of asking athletes questions that kind of pissed off, if not the athlete itself, then the local fans. Like one example, interview Asia Wilson after the Aces got steamrolled by the Liberty last year, and I kind of asked a question that kind of like came out the wrong way. But all I did was just ask certain media professionals who I've interviewed in the past again how to make it better for future interviews. And so that's pretty much all Gregg Doyel could do. I mean, from what I saw, he's been covering Indiana sports for a very long time, but now he's not going to get to cover the Indiana Fever this year. And this is Caitlin Clark's first year in the WNBA, based on that one comment alone. And obviously, you kind of see that article is already on awful announcing. Do you think that punishment was necessary for Gregg Doyel?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, like you mentioned, sports media members, like we're human too. We're not going to be perfect. Like I've messed up in interviews before. I've posted typos. Like there's all kinds of mistakes that media members make that are to be expected because we're human. But just because something is a mistake, if it causes harm or potential harm, it still has consequences, or it should have consequences. And I think the Greg Doyel situation too highlights another key issue in sports media. And it's the fact that when women's sports are gaining popularity at a time like this, it's a great time to start hiring more women's sports writers who have been in these spaces for years, instead of saying like, oh, well, Greg Doyle's covered, the Indiana Pacers for years, so he can cover women's basketball. I think he proved that that's not necessarily true, that those skills don't necessarily translate. And there's no shortage of popular and very competent and professional women's sports writers out there who have been covering women's sports for years, if not decades, who deserve a place at that table as well.
Yeah, exactly. Like you got friends vouching for friends that should get hired after they got laid off from their jobs. So you know what? I know you say you got laid off and you work and you do stuff for an awful announcement, but you need to get hired too. I mean, because you got. I mean, I see some stuff. You got a problem. I mean, you know you know your stuff. You're very knowledgeable, and I'm glad I got a chance to actually get you on the show so you can share your knowledge and wisdom of the announcing, just dedicated what's awful, what's not. I mean, emphasis on the name of the publication.
Yeah, thank you. As a shameless plug, I am unemployed. So if there are any sports media outlets in need of a women's sports writer, I've been covering collegiate and women's sports for over 4 years now. So thank you.
Yeah, and while you on the subject of you mentioned you covered collegiate women's sports. I mean, well, obviously we talk about Caitlin Clark coming into the WNBA, and also you got players like Angel Reese and Camila Cardoso, who's going to be out 4 to 6 weeks due to that injury, and then Cameron Brink, Rickea Jackson about to play the first season WNBA. And they the reason why the viewership got to the way it is right now, the WNBA draft and college basketball got to the way it was right now. And like, what impact do you think that these women will make in the WNBA when the season starts?
I think this draft class is just a historic class of incredible athletes. You know, it doesn't matter gender or sport, like they are just top tier world class athletes. And not only that, but these athletes are really, really good at making a name for themselves off of the court. And this is where I think name, image, and likeness really plays into the popularity of women's sports. Because I remember when I was first covering name, image, and likeness in 2019 and 2020, this was leading up to this all of the state level NIL bills and before NIL was a thing for college athletes, there was a lot of talk about how name, image, and likeness was going to be bad for female athletes. And there were people who were saying that it would be a Title IX violation, which is not true because NIL is third party endorsements. They're not, as of right now, they're not like university affiliated. That, you know, could change in the future. But there was talk about it being a Title IX violation. There was a lot of people saying, like, oh, well, the men are going to earn more and that's going to cause resentment from the women, which, you know, again, there have been gaps in terms of like who gets paid more, male versus female athletes. But, you know, like I said, women are absolutely holding their own in the NIL market as well. And with name, image, and likeness comes a boost in brand value, comes a boost in name recognition. Like Angel Reese was just at the Met Gala
I was just gonna get
yesterday.
into that. I was just gonna
Yeah.
get into that when you were done speaking because man, Angel Reese is looking stunning at the Met Gala.
Yeah, and
Seriously.
that would not have happened, you know, had she not cultivated her Bayou Barbie brand in college. So like name, image, and likeness is very much a business investment, but it's also, you know, a personal brand and a personal name investment as well. And I think Angel Reese is such a great case study as to how those investments follow these athletes even after their collegiate careers are done.
Exactly. Speaking of Angel Reese, how about the poor treatment that she got in her introductory press conference a couple weeks ago? I mean, I wasn't there because I was listening to a Zoom, but when I saw the footage, and it was sent by a friend. There was not that many viewership, but Caitlin Clark, she had the vindication she deserved. All Angel Reese get is reporters and the cameraman. That's pretty much it. Mind you, Angel Reese is a national champion. I know she did lose to Iowa the year after that, but she's a national champion, just like Camila Cardoso. And this is all how she gets welcome. We need to do better than that, man.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's another issue that I've seen with sports media over the years, not just with Caitlin Clark, but I remember several years ago with Paige Beckers as well. And Paige Beckers has called this out as well, but sports media, especially in women's basketball, you know, a league that is dominated by athletes who are not white, it the vast majority of sports media coverage tends to hyperfixate on white athletes. And we've seen this, you know, with Brianna Stewart winning MVP a couple years ago and earning there was like an activism award that she won during COVID that a lot of people pushed back on. And then with Sabrina Ionescu, you know, getting these brand names sneaker deals, whereas Asia Wilson doesn't have one for some reason.
Even though
Um,
Asia Wilson did sign a 2-year contract with Gatorade earlier today.
Yes, I saw the Gatorade contract. Yeah. There was a lot. One of my colleagues, Lindsay D'Arcangelo, wrote a column about how Asia Wilson, you know, deserves, you know, a big time sneaker deal because of everything that she's accomplished. But you know, unfortunately, sports media tends to hyper fixate on athletes that, you know, more fit the mainstream preference for, you know, white, stereotypically feminine, usually athletes. And so it's something that's another area that sports media really needs to do better on, is focusing on the talent, and not only the talent but like the marketability of these athletes. Because when you talk about Asia Wilson, like she's an instant New York Times bestseller. Like you can't
Mhm.
tell me that she's not marketable just with that statistic alone. And if you look at, you know, her accolades list is super, super long and impressive. Like she's a multi-time MVP, a multi-time WNBA champion. Like she is marketable and she has name recognition. And not only does sports media need to do a better job of recognizing that, and like Paige Becker said earlier this year, in spreading the love when it comes to coverage of athletes, not hyper fixating on one, but also the companies that you know are looking to engage with athletes or looking to partner with athletes, they need to pay attention to the ones that aren't necessarily as mainstream but deserve to be, because those brands can catapult those athletes into absolute legendary status.
Exactly. Exactly. It's important that these athletes get the major recognition and in marketing that they deserve, especially Angel Reese after what we saw at the Met Gala, and
Yeah.
also the media needs to put more investment into it. I'm glad that all four announcers actually putting some kind of investment into women's basketball, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Even if it means shot to the NBA, but yeah.
Yeah, and I do want to add, like, I don't want to come off as a Caitlin Clark hater. I think that she's a phenomenal athlete and she absolutely deserves recognition. She deserves her brand deals. Like, she was the obvious, first round, first pick of the WNBA draft this year. I don't think it was even a question who deserved that. But all of that being said, talent in women's basketball is absolutely not a new phenomenon. Like there have been many, many Caitlin Clark level players. If you look at like Diana Taurasi, Sue
Mhm.
Bird, Candace Parker, Cheryl Swoops, there have been like absolute legends on the court.
Without
The
question.
the big difference has always been the buy-in, the marketing, and the investment in women's sports. And now that we're seeing more of that, sports media really needs to step up and recognize talents that aren't going as mainstream as the poster player of the moment.
Yeah, exactly. To build off of that, I mean, I don't want to go too far ahead because we got WNBA to focus on. But when you get to college basketball next year for the women's side, you're going to have people like Paige Beckers, Deja Kelly, who just transferred to Oregon, so be that's who's alma mater. Yeah, and a bunch of in Malaysia for Wally, they're going to get the
Yes.
same marketing credibility when college basketball starts next year. But since we're still locked into this season with the WNBA, as we transition talking about like the state of sports broadcasting, there's a lot of major outreach that the WNBA is about to get. I mean, you got Ion about to do like a 30-minute pregame show for the double headers, as they announced earlier today. And then also the New York Liberty, they're going to be going to their local channels in Fox 5 and Mine 9. So they're going to have a share broadcasting New York Liberty games, who's going to give the fans within the New York area having more access to Liberty games outside of just the Yes Network or the MSG networks that they televised in the past that always had tape delays or end up getting played later because baseball's, or some other major networks televising it. And of course, the Aces, they're gonna have their own personal broadcasting channel. So with all the channel transitions for the WNBA teams, like what do you think it's gonna do for the engagement going forward?
Yeah, access has always been a huge issue in women's sports. Like I'm a 90s baby, and so I remember a life before streaming services.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad, so my mom was in the military, and so my dad was a stay-at-home dad. And he wanted to make sure that like growing up that I had female role models, in all of the media that I was consuming. So he worked very hard to make sure that I was watching women's sports, whether it was the Olympics or at the college level. And I remember it was very difficult to access a lot of women's sports, back when I was in elementary, middle, and high school. And even now, it's like I have friends who they know that I cover women's sports, that I know a lot about them. And they're always texting me and saying, like, hey, where can I watch this game? Where can I find highlights? Because the fact of the matter is, it's still not as easy as it should be to access women's sports, whether it's on social media or on streaming, because or on traditional sports media too, because the vast majority of coverage around like 85% goes to men's sports. And so with all of those avenues opening up, it's only going to be good things for women's sports moving forward. I think the WNBA is also in a bit of a learning and transition period, with all of the backlash about the lack of access to the preseason games. I think that that's going to cause a lot of good. So as long as fans, continue to show demand for these games, I think that the networks have no choice but to respond, because ignoring that is just a bad business move.
Exactly. I mean, you had Angel Reese making her debut, making a debut for the Chicago Sky, the preseason game against the Minnesota Lynx. Someone had to
Mhm.
live stream it just so people could actually see what's going on. And now that the demand is there, you got the Liberty and Chicago Sky preseason game about to get on the verge of being televised on the WNBA app.
Yeah,
So
Shane works.
that's how. So this is how you get people interested in women's sports. And I've been covering women's sports. I've been covering women's basketball since 2000, the WNBA since 2020 during the COVID era, when Zooms gave us the necessary access and get more outreach to journalists that needs to cover the WNBA. It needs to build up, not just for the sake of getting other people another angle, but also to expand the broadcasting landscape and to know that there are other shows out there other than just the ones that broadcast or write or do videographic on the WNBA and women's college basketball. So, yeah.
Yeah, Buick ran a great campaign a few years ago during March Madness, and basically it showed women's sports highlights like Katie Ledecky breaking her own, records at the Olympics, and Arika Gumbawale shooting the national championship game-winning shot, like back in, I think that was 2013 or 14.
2018, the back-to-back two
Yeah.
shots in a row. I did a podcast episode talking about it once.
Yeah, and Buick, it was great because they showed these highlights, but they only showed a sliver of them. Like the rest of the screen was black. And the idea behind it was like these women are making history, but if they're not on TV, nobody can see it happening, and that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very important. And we had to make sure that we get the outreach, and we had to make sure that publications like this, including awful announcing, gets like more preview shows or any kind of preview on the WNBA as we get to the season coming up. Last year we saw the Aces face Liberty in the finals, and it's not just about the excitement between those two super teams that everybody been preaching, because as Latricia, the coach for the Dallas Wings, always pinpoint, there are 12 super teams. They may not have the same superstar caliber players like the Aces of Liberty, but there are other super teams in the WNBA that are hungry for that championship. And after watching last year, viewership skyrocketed. The house was packed. I was at game 3 and 4 of the finals last year as doing media on it. The fans are going crazy to do it for a reason, and then it's because women start to grow, and then not to mention the viewership skyrocketed. So, what are your overall thoughts about what the Aces New York Liberty finals matchup did for the viewership and the engagement of the WNBA? And do we see something like that building off in 2024?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote for Awful Announcing about how that rivalry could, or that storyline could start a rivalry in women's sports, because I think that's kind of something that's missing from women's basketball, is there's not like a big heated rivalry yet. And a lot of that is because the league is very, very young. Like if you look at where the WNBA is right now, going into its 28th season, this is like the 1980s in terms of the NBA. And the NBA, that was right as the NBA was starting to really take off in popularity, in large part because of the Magic Bird matchup, and the rivalry that really launched the league. And so now that we have the Indiana Fever with Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston, and like these big stars who are coming into the game, I think that spells out a lot of really good potential for some rivalries. We're seeing college rivals who are now on the same team, like Boston and Clark and Cardozo and Reese. I think those are great, teammates, to just see how these athletes can go from rivals to teammates, and just the versatility of these athletes. But then I also think that, we're talking about super teams like with the Aces. I think that super teams can be very, very good for women's sports, because they create both a hero and a villain, because everybody loves underdogs. Everybody loves to watch dynasties and legacies fall. But then like you have these diehard Aces fans who they obviously want that legacy to continue. So it's storylines that tell sports. And when you have, underdogs versus giants, it's just a classic storyline. And the Liberty did great on roster retention this past off season. I think Seattle is a team to look out for as well, with all of the free agency success that they had in getting Neko Gwumike and Skylar Diggins-Smith, and with the draft getting Nika Mule. I think she's going to be a fantastic addition as well. So we're seeing no shortage of talent right now. And I think as teams become more competitive, and especially with these college rivalries, bleeding into the professional level, I think in the next few years, we're really going to see some good storylines at the pro level as well.
Yeah, you could be seeing some rivalries between Sabrina Vesco and Caitlin Clark, because look, with the New York, at one point in New York Liberty, you only had to pay like $10 or $20 to get the closest seats. Not courtside, but closest seats. Now you got people, they charge like literally over $200 just to watch the New York Liberty play Caitlin Clark in the ball of Brooklyn, which is where I'm from, by the way.
Yeah, and I think, going off of what we were talking about earlier with this Sabrina versus Steph matchup, I've heard that next year the NBA is looking to add Caitlin Clark, and I don't remember the other male shooter that they were going to have, but essentially having like a 2-on-2 kind of matchup, which is going to be really, really great for viewership and engagement as well, because wherever Caitlin Clark goes, the fans follow, and so I think that Caitlin Clark she's a great ambassador for the game, very, very good for women's basketball. I would like to see sports media focus a bit more on other talents that deserve praise and attention. But the Caitlin Clark effect is very, very real, and it's going to be good for the sport moving forward.
That's very important, and I'm glad you managed to study all that in the middle of going for a PhD, which is literally. I know you had to do a lot of deeper dive in order to accomplish that. Like, why don't you talk about how different the experience of getting that PhD at University of Texas from the bachelor's and the master's degrees that you earned, and how did that help you become the journalist that you are today?
Yeah, it's funny. I went basically from kindergarten through PhD. I didn't really take any breaks just because I had really good opportunities, come my way. And I was like I wasn't ever intending on getting a PhD, but when I was accepted to UT, I was like, it would be stupid for me to not take this. So I ended up moving, 800 miles south from Kentucky, where I'm from. And that experience, it was just so good for me because, I was a college athlete in a small town. A lot of people knew who I was. So like moving to a city where nobody knew my name was a really great experience for me. And not only that, it just like opened my eyes to different worldviews, and it really taught me a lot just about being a better person and a more empathetic person. But it also, taught me a lot about critical thinking and how, to really read a text, whether it's, a news article or an advertisement, because my field of study was language and rhetoric. And so we're always reading between the lines, trying to, decipher deeper meaning into the communication that we consume every day. I always tell people, if you don't think you're going to use your PhD, you probably, shouldn't get one, especially if you're going to go into debt. I was very lucky to not have any debt, in my education, because I was always working for the departments and got tuition reimbursements and all of that. But my PhD did help me be a better journalist because it taught me, to always ask the deep questions, to not be afraid to dig deeper into things. My field of sport communication is also very much focused on off the field issues. So I learned a lot about, everything from business to law to gender inequity through my studies. And without that experience, I don't think that I could be half of the journalist that I am now. So while I do tell people, if you don't think you're going to use your PhD, don't get it. But I use my PhD in a way that I don't think a lot of people would think to use a PhD. So it's a very personal decision whether or not to go into higher ed, whether that's, as in a faculty position or as a student. But for me, I'm very, very, very passionate about the power of education, because it really empowers you when you learn more about the world around you and how things work. And that education comes out sometimes in ways that you wouldn't expect. And that's definitely the case for me.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Dr. Katie. If it's right to say, because that's what the whole purpose of the PhD. I mean, we kind of like we kind of adopted to be to complete that degree.
Yes, doctor. Yeah, that's the correct title.
Yeah, but yeah, that's besides the point. I mean, obviously, you mentioned you've been an athlete. Like, how you think that being an athlete helps with sports journalism?
Yeah, I think, I don't think that athletic experience is absolutely necessary for someone to be a good sports journalist. I think it helps because, especially at the college level, you really see how the sauce is made. Like I remember um my experience as a college athlete was the first time I ever felt, dehumanized, because I was really valued for my productivity, almost exclusively in many cases. And so that realization really launched my interest in critical research when it came to NCAA policy and sports law and all the off the field issues that I studied as a graduate student and a PhD student. And so I know that without my experiences as a college athlete and seeing all of the behind the scenes and just how difficult life is for college athletes in a lot of ways, I know for a fact that I wouldn't have the depth that I do now when I'm covering sports and when I'm, talking about athletes and writing about athletes. I have a whole other scope of the industry that a lot of people don't get to experience firsthand. So, I know there are a lot of really excellent sports writers and just members of sports media who haven't played sports at the college or professional level. So I don't think it's absolutely necessary to do well in this field, but I don't think that experience hurts at all. And I think it can be very helpful when you're learning, about athletes as people rather than just what they can do on the field.
Exactly. Athletes are people just like us, just like journalists are people just like us. And I've interviewed one of my friends who now works with Fanatics, makes an Artie Franklin. He didn't even go to college. He started covering sports since he was like 60 years old. No college education. You learned to create writing. You learned to become a good writer on your own. Shout out to
Mhm.
him, by the way. You learn to become a good writer sometimes on your own. You learn to you learn to be a good videographer and a photographer by actually taking pictures and recording videos. That's how you become good at journalism. There are other areas to learn it. The athletics helps a lot because you're somebody that's actually been on that field before.
Mhm.
But as long as you have that mindset to succeed, you just have to make sure that you're going for it. And that's exactly what you did with that PhD. That gave you more experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a lot of formal education, but I totally agree with you. Like it's not about the education that you have on paper so much as it is about your skills, your passion, your experiences. And I think, more and more workplaces, as I'm looking at jobs right now, I'm seeing more and more job ads that are like no degree required, and I love that because oftentimes the degree just shows that you can commit yourself to something for 4 years. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be the best at your job or that you are this upper member of society necessarily. It just means that you committed to school for 4 years, which is great. Like there's a lot to be said for that. But there are a lot of areas too in the workplace where direct experience arguably has more benefits than the formal education aspect.
Exactly. And I know there's a lot of people that would say that I mean, there were times where I think about going for PhD, but then I thought to myself, you know what? I don't want to make myself
Hmm.
qualified, which I get why it could be bad, but it's also not bad at the same time. And you know what? You got to be overqualified and underqualified when it comes to your career path any day.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to freelancing, one of the big reasons that I also started freelancing my work, and one of the things that really deterred me from going into academia, and this is changing, but there's this widespread idea in academia that like when you do research, it should stay in the ivory tower. And the way that I explain this to people is a lot of academics view research like a car, like when you drive it off the lot, when you actually use it, it immediately deteriorates in value. That kind of logic is changing, I think, in higher ed. But that was one of the reasons that I was like, I need to, get into sports media because my research is at its best when it's applied. And that's something that, the academy tends to frown upon when you're applying it in the public domain. But for me, I'm like, I got this degree because I wanted to put my brain to good use. I wanted to teach people what I was learning and what I knew. And public scholarship through sports media was the best way for me to do that. So I didn't use my degree in a traditional sense, but I don't regret getting it. And I don't regret becoming a public scholar, even though I don't, have a tenure track stable job right now. I'm thinking that's going to change very soon. But I don't regret any of the paths that I've taken because I know at the end of the day that I put my research and my education to very good use. And it's not to say that people who go into academia aren't doing that, but I think where research comes into play, you have to recognize who you are as a researcher and what your strengths are. And my strength is definitely more in the public domain than in academia.
Yeah, exactly. And don't feel bad about getting laid off. As long as you got the connections and the people that people that you work with are by your side, I'm sure you're going to find yourself another opportunity someday.
Mhm. Honestly, for now, I'm enjoying freelancing. Like if I could freelance full time,
And that's fine.
absolutely. Yeah, I love it because like I have so much free time where I can just, write on my own time. If I don't want to write about something, I don't have to. Like I'm kind of my own boss right now. I can take more days off. So my work life balance is really great, and it's a nice recovery period from grad school because like I mean for about 7 years I was working myself to the point of burnout. So this past year out of academia has been really good for my mental health and just good for my work life balance, and freelancing has been a huge part of that. It's really nice to have a safety net for like the times that my employment has fallen through, to be able to still sustain myself while writing about the things that I love.
Yeah, and that's good inspiration for me as an independent freelancer myself. As I covered, so I mean for the past several years I covered WNBA, I've covered college basketball, highlighted by the Big East tournament this past spring, and then of course the NCAA tournament twice. So yeah, all my freelance creativity and the backup that I get for those colleges that have had a lot more than what some people think when I'm not reaching out to people for help is what helped me grow. Even when I'm not getting as much viewership as most media professionals, the fact that I'm getting myself out there, that's what helps a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, like with all the momentum in women's sports right now, like iHeartRadio just started like a women's sports only audio network, which I think is super cool.
Yeah, I saw that by Sarah Spin. They mentioned that on the women business this this convention last month.
Yeah, and I think that, movements like that are just indications that there are going to be a lot more openings in women's sports media lately because as that demand grows, there's going to also be a demand for really, high quality content from people who have been there, boots on the ground, and have been, covering women's sports for a long time. So I'm also hopeful that there are going to be more job openings for those of us who are interested in covering women's sports full time in the future.
That's the same thing I'm thinking myself.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for stopping by, Dr. Katie Liver.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. This is fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate talking sports with you, and hopefully you continue doing the don't let the title awful announcing fool you. There are some good announcing nuggets you'll find in that publication. Make sure you continue to follow the work at awful announcing and many other freelance work that you're planning to do. And once again, congratulations, Dr. Katie. I know you're going to do well, being the doctor that you are and the sports media professional that you are. Just keep on working, and then opportunity will come to you.
Thank you so much, Rafik. I appreciate it. And you're doing great too.
For Rafik, it was Dr. Katie Laver. We'll see you next time.